On paper, it's one of the most Western-leaning states in the former Soviet Union. A one-time victim of Russian aggression, the South Caucasus nation of Georgia today revels in its pro-Western identity. Its people overwhelmingly want to join the European Union. Article 78 of its constitution compels the government to seek NATO membership. On a practical level, there are already strong links with the alliance. Tbilisi's soldiers train with NATO instructors and have taken part in missions. Clearly, if any country was going to be a shoo-in for membership, it would be Georgia. Or would it? Despite record-high support for joining, Georgia's ruling party seems to be going out of its way to sabotage relations not just with NATO, but with the entire West. At a time when Russian missiles fall on Ukrainian cities, Georgia's prime minister repeats Kremlin talking points. The government accuses NATO of trying to open a new front in the war. Elsewhere, parliament systematically dismantles the country's checks and balances, a surefire way of blocking EU and NATO accession. So, how did things come to this? How did overwhelmingly pro-West Georgia get into a situation where its own government seems to be sabotaging its aspirations? Well, today we're gonna dive into the murky waters of Georgian politics and ask if Tbilisi can ever fulfill its stated goal of joining NATO. Nestled on the eastern shores of the Black Sea, the tiny mountainous nation of Georgia is well off the radar for most Americans and Europeans. At a mere 69,700 square kilometers and home to just 3.7 million people, the country is semi-invisible in the West. Mention it offhand to most people, and they'll assume you're talking about Georgia the state. Yet, while this one-time Soviet republic may not frequently intrude on the minds of those of us living in NATO countries, the same isn't true in reverse. For decades now, Tbilisi has been officially trying to join both the alliance and other Western institutions like the EU. Article 78 of the Georgian constitution instructs the government to pursue membership of both, with the 2018 amendment insisting the nation's leaders to, quote, take all measures to ensure the full integration of Georgia into the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Among regular folk too, there's genuine passion for both projects. While joining the EU is more popular overall, with about 80% of Georgians supporting the idea, NATO membership is likewise seen favorably. One March 2023 poll found that 73% of the public were pro-joining the alliance, while only 13% were against. In many ways, this only reflects what's been an ongoing process since the early 2000s. Over the decades, NATO and Georgia have built so many ties that Tbilisi appears closer to the alliance than even many member states. Since 2015, for example, the NATO-Georgia Joint Training and Evaluation Center at Krysanisi military base has been responsible for training Tbilisi's troops. During the alliance's Resolute Support mission in Afghanistan, Georgia committed more of its forces per capita than any other non-member state. In diplomatic engagement too, Tbilisi is probably cozier than any other non-member that's not called Ukraine. An enhanced opportunities partner, Georgia has, per Georgian outlet Civil, hosted the North Atlantic Council 5 times and the NATO Military Committee 4 times. According to Civil, this is, to quote again, unprecedented for a non-member of NATO. On top of that, the South Caucasus nation is also the recipient of the substantial NATO-Georgia package, a tranche of military aid intended to keep Tbilisi's forces strong and interoperable with the alliances. Basically, if this was The Bachelor, then Georgia would be that slightly crazy contestant absolutely determined to get to the finale and make themselves into the perfect match. And yet, despite all of this, NATO membership for Georgia looks further away than perhaps it's ever been. While Ukraine's potential accession is a talking point in alliance capitals, cheered on by places like Ankara and Vilnius, fretted over in Berlin and Washington, Georgia's candidacy seems to be on ice. And that'll perhaps be for the foreseeable future. What's pushing relations between these partners into a cooler made of liquid nitrogen is something we'll be analysing across, well, most of this video. First though, it's worth taking a little bit of a detour, one that will, hopefully, illuminate both Tbilisi's links with NATO and explain why the country is meant to be seeking shelter under the alliance's nuclear umbrella. A detour through Georgia's post-independence history. While many of the nations that split off from the USSR in 1991 managed to do so peacefully, Georgia was one of the unlucky few that immediately plunged into conflict. As a constituent republic of the Soviet Union, Georgia had also been home to a couple of second-tier autonomous republics, or ASSRs, as well as the Autonomous Oblast of South Ossetia. In the Soviet system, these regions existed to give some semblance of local control to ethnic minorities. In Georgia's case, this included the Abkhaz people and the Ossetians. secessions. When the USSR imploded and the major republics declared independence, some of these autonomous republics tried to do the same. In Georgia, Moldova, Russia, and Azerbaijan, separatist movements all tried to create brand new tiny states. Tiny states that existed on land that the newly independent countries felt belonged to them. The predictable result of that was war. For its first few years as an independent country, Georgia was mired in conflicts. Conflicts that ended not with victory for Tbilisi, but with two de facto, if mostly unrecognized states, occupying chunks of Georgian land. On the Black Sea coast, Abkhazia now controlled about half of the nation's shoreline. In the north, South Ossetia clung to the mountains separating Georgia from Russia. Although the fighting had stopped in both regions by 1994, no lasting peace would be found. It would be these frozen conflicts, more than anything, that would come to define Georgia's next decade and a half. At the same time all of this was happening, another story was unfolding. One that's at the center of today's video, a story that we might call Georgia's journey toward the West. As early as 1994, Tbilisi had joined NATO's Partnership for Peace. By 2002, President Eduard Shevardnadze was promising to knock on NATO's door as the alliance enlarged. But it would be with Shevardnadze's downfall in the 2003 Rose Revolution that the process really picked up steam. With the classically Soviet figure of Shevardnadze gone, space had appeared for a brand new form of leadership, one that was bombastically pro-West. And no figure was quite as bombastic as Mikhail Saakashvili. You know how newspapers politely like to describe certain figures as colourful? Well, Saakashvili was like an explosion in a paint factory. A guy of such singular personality that he managed to dominate Georgian politics for nearly a decade. As president, Saakashvili's goal was to drag his nation kicking and screaming into NATO. In 2008, he organized and won a nationwide referendum on joining the alliance, a move intended to send a firm signal ahead of NATO's meeting in Bucharest that year. Along with Ukraine, the hope was that Georgia would be granted a membership action plan or MAP, a clear roadmap leading to a shelter under the alliance's nuclear umbrella. In this, Saakashvili was backed by the USA. But as many of you will remember from NATO's recent troubles inviting in Sweden, just having Washington in your corner is not enough. Every single other member must agree for a new country to join. And in 2008, Germany and France were absolutely not in the mood to admit Tbilisi or Kyiv. The result was an infamous declaration in which the alliance basically said, sure, you can join one day, don't ask us when or how or what you need to do or, anything else, just someday. Okay? Now, to call this the worst of both worlds would be a bit of a planet-sized understatement. The agreement that Georgia would one day join NATO sent Vladimir Putin into a fury. At the same time, though, the lack of clear commitments failed to boost Tbilisi's security. Or as Chatham House policy expert Orisha Lutsevich much later told Reuters, the Bucharest summit left a lot of bad aftertaste and actually created the strategic ambiguity, the permanent NATO waiting room for Ukraine and Georgia. It was a waiting room Putin was determined to ensure that they never left. Just 4 months after the Bucharest summit, war broke out between Russia and Georgia. If you want the full details, well, we did a whole video on this that you can find in our archives. But the Crib Notes version is that the separatists in South Ossetia shelled Georgia, so Georgia sent in the army only to realize it had all been a trap when Russian armor swept across the border. In 5 days of fighting, 850 people were killed, 35,000 Georgians were driven from their homes, and Russian tanks came within kilometers of Tbilisi. Effectively, the entire Georgian Navy and Air Force were destroyed. When the shooting stopped, 20% of Georgian territory comprising Abkhazia and South Ossetia remained under permanent Russian occupation, and it stayed that way ever since. For many Georgians, their swift, painful defeat in 2008 made joining NATO an even more urgent priority. Even after Saakashvili's party lost power in 2012, with Saakashvili himself stepping down as president in 2013, the drive west remained government policy, the only possible security guarantee for a tiny nation right on Russia's doorstep. Or, well, so the thinking used to go. Because, as we're about to see, the last year and a half has seen a fundamental shift in government. A shift that has done what Russian tanks alone never managed to do. A shift to a world in which Tbilisi joining NATO is starting to seem like an impossible dream. Going by official statements alone, you'd think that Georgia today was still tracing its old pro-NATO path. April this year saw Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili of the ruling Georgian Dream Party meet Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and tell him Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspiration remains our top foreign policy priority. within the nation's institutions. The official line is that a 12-step reform plan to boost Tbilisi's EU candidacy is already underway, one that would likewise have a positive impact on NATO membership. But this is merely the surface detail. The smiling, pro-Western-faced Georgian dream presents to the world. Start to peel away the makeup, and what's underneath looks real different. In the 18 months since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the government has been growing closer to Russia. From a Western perspective, disturbingly close. Not only has Tbilisi refused to join sanctions, it's actually increased trade with its former overlord. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, quote, in 2022, Georgia's exports to Russia increased by 6.8% to $652 million, while imports soared by 79% to $1.8 billion, the highest level for the past 16 years, end quote. At the same time, Georgian Dream has been desperately sending signals to Putin to suggest the party is on his side. About a month after his meeting with Jens Stoltenberg, Prime Minister Garabashvili sat before a security conference in Bratislava and blamed NATO for the war in Ukraine. To quote, one of the main reasons for the war was NATO, right? NATO enlargement. One of the reasons was Ukraine's will and determination to become a member of NATO. And so, therefore, we see the consequences. The quote ends. I should probably go without saying, but trash-talking a club you want to be a member of is not a good way to be a member of said club. Yet Georgian Dream is routinely trash-talking NATO with all the gusto of a professional wrestler taunting his opponent. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, Open Caucasus media analyzed the statements being made by party chairman Irakli Kobakidze. Over 5 months, Kobakidze made 9 comments critical of Russia compared to 26 critical of Ukraine and nearly 60 about the West. These aren't isolated events. Multiple high-ranking members of Georgian Dream have repeatedly accused both NATO and the EU of trying to, quote, to drag Georgia into the war against Russia. The result of these outbursts has been to drive Tbilisi further from both institutions. The NATO Secretary General's special representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia declared of Georgia's behavior last year that, quote, we are concerned as an alliance and the allies themselves. Meanwhile, The Guardian reports that Prime Minister Garabashvili has picked fights with the European Parliament, accusing them of peddling LGBTQ+ propaganda, while his defense minister calls liberalism a threat to the nation's security. If you pay any attention to European news, you might be thinking this sounds like Georgian Dream are deliberately channeling Viktor Orban, almost as if the spirit of the Hungarian autocrat has somehow possessed Tbilisi. In this, you might be mostly right, actually. Foreign Policy spoke with Ito Bugiashvili at the Atlantic Council, who suggested all this rhetoric was part of a deliberate strategy, a way of ensuring NATO will never join NATO or the EU without the politically costly risk of just coming out and saying that they're not interested. By intentionally pushing the EU's buttons by mimicking Orban, Georgian Dream know that they are torpedoing their bid to join the bloc. Likewise, declaring NATO started the Ukraine war is pretty much guaranteed to piss off the entire alliance. Or as Ito Bugiashvili put it appears that backsliding of democracy, failed judiciary reforms, political prosecution, assault on free media and pro-democracy activists, and attacks on freedom of speech are done intentionally to prevent Georgia from becoming a part of the Western institutions. End quote. As that list suggests, the plot goes beyond merely bad-mouthing the West. In the last couple of years, Georgian Dream has been executing a power grab, stacking the judiciary to such an extent that the US recently sanctioned 4 senior judges for corruption. They've also imprisoned former President Mikhail Saakashvili on trumped-up charges and may even be slowly poisoning him to death. At least, that's according to Saakashvili's supporters. If nothing else, they seem to be denying him adequate medical care. Taken together, these comments and actions are the perfect way to sabotage the pro-West aspirations of Georgia's people, throwing down a roadblock future governments will struggle mightily to overcome. So at this stage, you might be a little bit confused, perhaps thinking something along the lines of, hold on a second, Russia attacked these guys 15 years ago and still occupies a fifth of their country, but they secretly don't want to ever join NATO? How does this make any sense, Simon? Well, to answer that, we only need to use a single word. And that magical word is oligarchy. More to the point, actually, a single oligarch, around whom everything in Georgia turns. An oligarch desperate to bend an entire nation to his whims. If you want to understand modern Georgia, there's no better way than first understanding its most powerful man, Bidzina Ivanishvili. The founder of Georgian Dream, Ivanishvili, is also a man of staggering wealth in a country where the average monthly wage clocks in at about $650. With over $5 billion to his name, Ivanishvili's wealth is, according to The Guardian, equivalent to more than a quarter of Georgia's GDP. Not that his power only derives from his money. Despite retiring as Prime Minister in 2013 after only a year in the post and leaving politics altogether in 2021, Ivanishvili still retains a vice-like grip on the ruling Georgian Dream Party. The current Prime Minister, for example, is a former employee of his construction firm. The head of security worked in several of his businesses. The Interior Minister started out as Ivanishvili's head bodyguard. So you know how Donald Trump continues to push the Republican Party along certain trajectories despite no longer being president? Well, Ivanishvili is like that, except on steroids. According to Foreign Policy, every single current minister was once one of his personal aides. Speaking to The Guardian, the vice president of Georgia Institute for Strategic Studies declared, "We are basically a one-man dominated political system where the oligarch Ivanishvili is basically fine-tuning everything." And what Ivanishvili wants to do right now, it seems, is fine-tune his nation into becoming a supporter of Russia. Although born in Georgia during the Soviet era, Ivanishvili made most of his fortune in Moscow. Specifically, he was one of the oligarchs who took control of major state industries in the wild days of 1990s privatization before selling his accumulated business interests off for an absolute killing. Where that wealth today is stored is a matter of some controversy. Ivanishvili's name has cropped up in almost every major financial investigation of the last few years, from the Panama Papers to the Pandora Papers. But some suspect at least part of it is still tied up in Russia, where the Kremlin tightly controls who has access to what. All of which may explain the distinctly pro-Russian direction Ivanishvili has recently been tiptoeing in. According to Foreign Policy, to quote, experts place the blame for Georgia's hard turn toward Russia with billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. At this stage, we need to point out that Ivanishvili denies all of this. He denies he's pro-Russian or that he's even still active in the nation's politics. Not that he's convincing many people of that, though. Back in 2022, the European Parliament adopted a resolution calling for sanctions on Ivanishvili, a resolution that highlighted his destructive role in Georgia's economy and political life. Others have gone even further. Vasu Katilia, a former Georgian ambassador to the United States, has claimed Ivanishvili is the informal ruler of Georgia and a Russian ally. Previously, when we've done these videos on aspiring or potential NATO candidates, we've always tried to include the political dimension in our analysis. A good chapter or two sandwiched between technical discussions of military prowess or interoperability. In Georgia's case, though, these other parts are basically neither here nor there. Under Ivanishvili's shadow, everything is about the political dimension. At a minimum, it'll stay that way until the next elections in 2024. Right now, the opposition is trying to fight back against Ivanishvili's and Georgian Dream's anti-NATO stances, but they simply hold too few seats in parliament to affect any change. For most Georgians, this must be a depressing thought, that you live in a country overwhelmingly pro-West, but because of a single oligarch, all 3.7 million of you are being dragged ever deeper into Vladimir Putin's ice-cold and suffocating embrace. Still, we don't want to turn this entire video into an overview of one man's colossal reach. Let's assume for a moment that, aside from just money, Georgian Dream has rational reasons for its sudden, new, anti-Western course. In that case, what might those reasons be? For many non-NATO nations in Europe, Russia's unprovoked and genocidal attack on Ukraine was a bit of a wake-up call as to the alliance's value. Within months, both Finland and Sweden applied to join. Ukraine, likewise, is pinning its hopes for post-war security on a seat at the table. Heck, even Ireland at least discussed the possibility of joining NATO, a possibility since rejected. In Georgia, though, the onslaught seems to have pushed many government officials in the opposite direction. Rather than a security guarantee, many seem to believe that taking steps to join the alliance today would actually put them in increased danger. The basic outline of this idea is that if Putin really is determined to stop NATO expansion, then Russia would be at its most dangerous in the period between Georgia receiving its membership action plan and actually joining. During that time, Tbilisi wouldn't be covered by NATO's collective defense policy, the famous Article 5 that would bring not just most of Europe's armies, but also Uncle Sam running to help. And Georgian officials are worried NATO wouldn't risk war with Russia for a nation not yet a member. As one Western diplomat in Georgia told Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where they used to view receiving a membership action plan as a positive step, the Prime Minister made it clear in Bratislava that maybe his perception is that steps short of actual security guarantees actually increase Georgia's vulnerability. This has been exacerbated by a perception in Tbilisi that the West hasn't done enough to help Ukraine. If you're from one of the countries that has poured billions of dollars of equipment into Ukraine to help Kiev fend off the Russian assault, that might sound a little bit screwy. Clearly, NATO is trying to help drive Russia out as best it can. But that's not how it looks to some in Georgia's government, for whom a Russian invasion is not a mere possibility, but something they have actual recent experience of. Right now, were Russia to suddenly strike from its bases in South Ossetia, Georgia would be in existential danger. Unlike Ukraine, where the nation's sheer size means that the city of Kiev had days to prepare for the arrival of Russian forces, Georgia is such a tiny country that you wouldn't even be able to comfortably watch Oppenheimer before armor was at your front door. According to The Guardian, to quote, if the Russians did strike from South Ossetia, they could cut Georgia's main east-west highway in a few minutes and be in Tbilisi within a couple of hours. From this perspective, anything other than a concerted NATO drive to expel Russia from Ukraine probably would look underwhelming. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it thusly. To Tbilisi, Western military aid for Ukraine looks insufficient to end the war, while Russia has succeeded in retaining control of large parts of the country. Georgian officials believe the balance of power is shifting in Russia's favor. From this angle of cold calculation, tilting softly towards Russia may be the only rational thing that Georgia can do, performing what Viktor Kipiani, chairman of the GeoCase think tank in Tbilisi, told the New York Times was a balancing act, an attempt to mollify the angry giant nation on their doorstep while not completely burning bridges with the West. To put it in extremely simple terms, working with Russia allows the Georgian economy to get fat off increased trade and travel. In other words, a tangible plus. Running for the NATO security umbrella, on the other hand, offers both possible benefits as well as the potential for nationwide Armageddon. To quote Viktor Kipiani in the New York Times, the country is a prisoner of its own geography. And of course, there's one actor that we haven't really heard from yet, or rather, one set of actors with its own opinions on the pluses and minuses of Georgia's security situation. We're talking, of course, about NATO itself. For all the focus in NATO capitals on Georgia's democratic backsliding, the truth is that this may be just a red herring, a bucket of pungent seafood intended to distract from the real issues. We can deduce this because the alliance has a previous track record of letting in or tolerating nations with less than stellar forms of government. Greece, for example, remained a member even after the colonels established their military dictatorship. Today, autocratic regimes like Turkey and Hungary are still in the club despite their questionable commitment to democracy. More to the point, NATO has recently admitted new members with problematic politics. In 2017, Montenegro entered the alliance, followed in 2020 by North Macedonia. In 2021, Transparency International ranked both nations far behind Georgia for corruption. Given all that, it seems unlikely that rule of law is the only thing worrying NATO's members about Georgia's bid. So, where might the real problem lie? Our best guess is in the two separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Over its history, NATO has occasionally admitted states with disputed territory. West Germany, for example, joined back when the country's east was still locked away behind the Iron Curtain. Likewise, the alliance has a few member states with territories its security guarantee does not cover. Guam and Hawaii are both explicitly excluded from America's Article 5 protection, as is Reunion Island from France's. Still, admitting a state with 20% of its territory under Russian occupation would be a massive step. Even if the alliance and Georgia both agreed that Abkhazia and South Ossetia were not covered by NATO's security guarantee, there would simply be too high a risk of confrontation with Russia. Given how careful NATO has been about not getting dragged into the Ukraine war so far, it's understandable members might not want to run the risk of antagonizing Moscow in the South Caucasus, especially considering how hard Georgia would be to defend. One massive advantage Ukraine has enjoyed in this war is the sheer amount of border that it shares with NATO countries. Arms and equipment can readily flow in from Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, and could have likewise flowed in from Hungary had Orban not been a massive tool and blocked them. Georgia, on the other hand, borders a single NATO member, Turkey, and that border is pretty short and covered with mountains. Only two major roads connect Georgia's interior with Turkey. In the event of a conflict, that would create two obvious strategic choke points for Russia to attack, basically making resupply very difficult. Combined with the short distance between Russian forces in South Ossetia and the capital of Tbilisi, and you can start to see why NATO members might consider Georgia just too difficult to defend. Or, as War on the Rocks put it in 2021, defending a country as remote as Georgia puts in doubt NATO's ability to deploy the substantial in-theater and backup forces and equipment this would require. It also puts in doubt America's willingness to greatly enhance its existing deterrence initiative and, not least, carry the financial burden. Of course, the counter-argument is that putting Georgia's NATO bid on ice because of fear of Russia effectively hands Vladimir Putin a veto over Tbilisi's foreign policy. It also raises the question of whether the alliance truly has an open-door policy, or if that's just a comforting fiction that the members tell themselves. Nonetheless, these are real problems NATO must grapple with when deciding whether to admit Georgia, a decision the alliance has now successfully been putting on hold for a good 15 years. So to come to the end of today's video, then, it might feel like we've answered our headline question. Will Georgia ever join NATO? With a firm no. Certainly, there are good reasons to be pessimistic, a ruling party consolidating power even as it snuggles up close to the Kremlin, a difficult strategic environment, a fear in both Brussels and Tbilisi that starting the process might invite a massive Russian backlash. Yet, for all the matter may seem settled, there are small grounds for optimism too. Not just in the ongoing military cooperation between NATO and Georgia, but in the people of Georgia themselves. With around 3/4 of Georgians wanting to join the alliance, it seems reasonable to think their government can only hold them back for so long. Sure, it might not be an easy road, but if we truly believe in self-determination for all peoples, then it's hard to see how NATO could ultimately refuse Tbilisi's accession. Because in Georgia, we have a country that has already suffered 15 years of Russian aggression and hybrid warfare. They are the only other nation in Europe that has even the remotest idea of how Ukrainians feel right now. Their past may have been defined by the colossus on their northern border, but if Georgians get their way, then maybe, just maybe, the future will be defined by something else, by the freedom to choose a new destiny far from the Kremlin's clutches.